How are you doing today, Don?
I'm doing great. Great. It's good to be here, and I'm talking again about the failures of Christianity, and I'm still just scratching the surface, still scratching away.
That's I've done
a lot of failure, so much fail, so few gods. I've previously discussed this topic 22 times, so this is number 23. Plus a number of others that could be considered part of this category. Today I want to talk about Christianity's dependence on ignorance. Well, what is ignorance? Well, ignorance is the lack of knowledge or information, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. We're all ignorant about a lot of things, but it's not something to be embraced either. It's something that you want to try to be uncomfortable about and go learn. Take it as an opportunity when you find out you're ignorant about something, go learn about it, go figure it out. But Christianity embraces and cultivates ignorance, as we'll see in a bit. And con games require ignorance of the victim for it to work. So what's the difference here between Christianity and a con game? A valid institution or belief shouldn't need ignorance. It shouldn't need it. So therefore, Christianity's dependence on ignorance is just yet another failure, as far as I'm concerned. Well, how does Christianity depend on ignorance? Well, ignorance is part of the Christianity's worldview, as far as I'm concerned. They go to a lot of trouble to maintain ignorance, especially about certain topics. They deny evidence, and they promote ignorance in some of their cultural institutions. So ignorance is a worldview. Well, any mystery, especially even a scientific mystery, is immediately met with the answer, God did it. But there's no evidence for a God, and there's no evidence that a God actually did anything. So this becomes kind of a God of the gaps idea of when science doesn't know something or when we don't know something, we assert God, or Christians assert that there's a God, but as we learn more, as our ignorance gets smaller, God gets smaller. And God sort of becomes a synonym for our ignorance. So it becomes a placeholder for the things we don't know. And Christians and many other religious believers treat this God of ignorance as something to be worshipped rather than something to be, addressed or dealt with. And the main Christian argument that we hear from callers is really an argument from ignorance, and that's a logical fallacy. And it kind of takes the form, if you don't know, God must have done it. If you can't prove otherwise, God must have done it. And that's kind of a lame way to argue for something. Logical fallacies are not a way to build a framework of knowledge or anything.
If I can
go ahead.
In
yeah, please do.
When Matt and I were talking to Ray Comfort, I remember actually being specifically ready for something he would say, because it's something that he always says.
Were you there?
No, that's Ken Ham.
That's Ken Ham.
One's from New Zealand.
Right.
I know they sound similar.
Aussies and New Zealanders, Kiwis.
Yeah, but Ray Comfort's shtick is, is it possible you could be wrong? Do you know things for certain? And we're intellectually honest, so we say, no, we don't. And he, at that point, says, yes, but I do.
Which is dishonest.
Yeah, I mean, and it's still a glorification of ignorance, like you're putting it, but it is sort of identifying as absolutely certain stuff that you are not really in a position to know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's a good point, and that's actually something I never really sort of touched on here. So yeah, there's a lot of different tactics, and so there's the "were you there" tactic. Right. But the answer to that is, well, neither were you, right? So how do you know what you know, or how do you know what you claim to know? And any criticism of the actions of God is met with, oh, God works in mysterious ways, i.e., you're ignorant. Well, if that's true, then if we don't really know the mind of God, then aren't churches frauds by claiming to know the mind of God and claiming to tell you what God thinks and what God wants and these sorts of things? So there's a lot of little mind games that are sort of intertwined with Christianity, and Christianity really kind of maintains a propaganda machine, and it sows a lot of lies and misinformation to keep their flocks ignorant. And the ignorance of the flocks pays dividends when the collection plate is passed. And we're going to talk briefly about science, history, and the Bible. Well, in science, the theory of evolution has to be squashed down and denigrated, because that's bad news, because if there was no special creation, then there was no fall of man, and no reason for Jesus' existence, and the crucifixion is just gory performance art. So if you go down the evolution front, Christianity doesn't make a lot of sense. The whole foundation of it gets eroded away. Similarly, with climate change, we're seeing Christians embrace climate change denialism a lot, as well as businesses, of course, that would be affected by that. But I think the motivation for Christians there is, if mankind can destroy God's creation, then God must not be very powerful. I think that that's part of the deal. And there's also the issue of who's going to be your authority. And there's also this attitude of screw the environment. God gave us dominion over that, and we don't care. In other areas of science, we have no evidence for God, we have no evidence for the soul, no evidence for the afterlife, or most religious claims. And Christians aren't going to tell you these things, like religious leaders aren't going to tell you these things in church. There's also problems of dealing with overpopulation, sex education, and cloning. These are all areas of science that religions tend to try to sow ignorance about. Well, what about history? Well, the bloody history of Christianity is sanitized in textbooks. And how many people know about the Cathars or the Peasants' Rebellion or the 30 Years' War, which really reflect very badly on Christianity? How many people were murdered during the Christianization of the Americas, and is that ever discussed in history classes? Who knew that Martin Luther's anti-Semitic writings helped to make the Holocaust a religiously motivated horror it was? So these things aren't taught. And Christians embrace folks like David Barton, who tell lies about the founding of the United States. And there's a lot of modern propaganda about the U.S. as being successful, a successful country because of Christianity. But in reality, this is because of capitalism, democracy, and the spirit of free enterprise, which are concepts not found in the Bible. Well, what about the Bible aren't Christians telling you in their sermons and things? There's lots of things you won't learn in church. The Bible is really a genocide manual if you go and look through it and see all the murders and things that are advocated and asked for. And it's spun at different times for different purposes. And so it's being spun today for today's purposes. They won't tell you that the earliest copy of the earliest gospel, which is Mark, knew nothing of the resurrection. The people, the person who wrote it either didn't think it was important or didn't know about it, which is a bit odd. They won't tell you in church that the resurrection was common in various mythologies, earlier mythologies, as a means of explaining the seasons, and that it was something that was rattling around in Rome at the time Christianity was being invented. They won't tell you in church that you can pray for anything that you want and get it. There's lots of Bible quotes that tell you that. And you can try that out at home and pray and see that it fails. They won't tell you that the Virgin Mary is a mistranslation. The birth story was added much later than the story, other stories about Jesus. They won't tell you that the return of Christ already hasn't happened. And they won't tell you about lots of contradictions and other problems. But atheists are glad to tell you about that. I watched a debate not too long ago between Ken Ham and Bill Nye, Bill Nye the science guy. And Ken Ham is the Answers in Genesis guy from New Zealand, right?
No. That one's Australia.
Australia, okay.
We also talked about that on the nonprofits.
Yeah, and I was just very frustrated. I mean, here's an example of Ham asserting that historical evidence is inherently different than observational evidence.
Right, yeah, a lot.
Yeah, and it's the idea that you aren't there, so you don't know a damn thing, therefore I can assert whatever I want in that place. Mm-hmm. And his argument really works for last Tuesdayism, or whatever they call it, where
I mean, some like fundamentalists will go way overboard with that whole science can't really know anything kind of thing, to the extent that they, try to argue that the speed of light might have changed for all we know. That basic fundamental principles of science, if we weren't around to look at them, then they could be anything.
Right. But you could make the same claim about you don't know anything before you woke up this morning, right? Because you weren't there. You were absent during that little bit of time, and God could have created the whole universe while you were asleep. And so the same sort of argument applies to all sorts of nonsense. So Ken Ham wants to substitute Bible stories instead, and he just wants to assert all that stuff. And his way of arguing, which is necessary to support his version of Christianity, is really maintaining ignorance. It's a denial of evidence that comes up, and it's a bunch of just so stories. Well, how do Christians promote ignorance among the populace? Well, if you're sitting in Sunday school, you're going to be led in your learning exercises, and you're going to be spoon-fed stuff, and you're going to be steered away from anything questionable. And if you have any questions, you're going to be shut down or browbeaten or whatever. And they're going to inoculate you against learning the truth. They're going to actually redefine the word truth to mean Bible stuff, right? Truth. You see the word truth all the time, and they're trying to take over that term, just like they try to take over this word science. Questioning is discouraged, and they'd want to keep you away from people like us, evil atheists, that know more about your religion than you do, because we'll teach you. And we'll teach you, we know all the skeletons are buried.
Right. So, well, I mean, there are Bible verses which will tell you that just doubting things is a sin. And
sure.
So that prevents you from looking too deeply into stuff that just doesn't make sense to you. You should instead just go with the Ray Comfort way of thinking, which is, well, I really, really know the stuff that I want to believe.
Right.
I can just be positive that I'm right.
Yeah, and it sits on the shoulders of charisma, right? It's charisma that forces it out there.
Yeah.
Well, there's an active movement in Christianity to seize control of education, to make K through 12 pro-Christian, prayer in school, these sorts of things. There's this attitude of keep your kids from going to college because they're going to lose their faith when they learn something. And they want to promote propaganda in the public square, like David Barton's foolishness. And they treat willful ignorance, otherwise known as faith, as a virtue, which it's not. So any institution that relies on and cultivates ignorance fails to distinguish itself from a fraud. And it sabotages humanity's capabilities for its own benefit, and it marks itself as inherently bad. And Christianity is that, and it's an apparent con that becomes evident the more you know about it, and so that's another failure of Christianity. Okay. Mm-hmm.